The restaurant was bustling, with the sound of clinking glasses and quiet chatter filling the air. It was the kind of place that prided itself on an upscale vibe and impeccable service. The staff moved with precision, their crisp uniforms and polished manners reflecting the high standards the establishment was known for. But not everyone on the team seemed to embrace those values. At one corner of the room, a woman entered, her presence understated yet confident. She wasn't dripping in designer labels or making a grand entrance, but there was something about her, a quiet elegance, a calm self-assuredness. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the room as though looking for someone. Before she could take a step toward a table, one of the waiters approached her, his expression already tinged with irritation. This waiter had a reputation among the staff. While he was skilled at his job, his attitude could be hit or missed depending on the customer. He judged people quickly, often deciding within seconds whether they were worth his effort. And today, something about this woman triggered his less flattering side. "Ma'am, we're quite busy," he said curtly, cutting her off before she could even speak. "Do you have a reservation?" His tone wasn't exactly rude, but it carried an edge, an undercurrent of disdain, as though he had already decided she didn't belong there. The woman raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback. "I was hoping to grab a table," she said, her voice even and polite. The waiter crossed his arms, glancing over his shoulder at the full dining room. "Well, as you can see, we're packed. Next time, maybe call ahead." He gestured vaguely toward the door, as if dismissing her entirely. A few nearby diners noticed the exchange, their curious eyes flicking back and forth between the two. Some murmured quietly, their expressions a mix of amusement and discomfort. The woman, however, remained calm. She wasn't the type to cause a scene. Instead, she smiled faintly, a gesture that only seemed to annoy the waiter further. "Look, I don't have time to stand here and chat," he added, rolling his eyes. "If you're not going to order something right now, I suggest you leave. We're busy enough without people loitering." Her eyes flickered with something. Was it amusement? Disappointment? It was hard to tell. But instead of arguing, she simply nodded. "I understand," she said softly. "Thank you for your time." Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, her composure intact despite the obvious rudeness she had just endured. The waiter muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as he walked away. To him, it was just another interaction, another moment of his day that he wouldn't give a second thought. But the other staff members were uneasy. Something about the woman felt familiar. The way she carried herself, the calm authority in her voice. It was as if she belonged there, as if she were more than just another diner. One of the newer servers leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "Do you think she's someone important?" She didn't look like the usual crowd, but... The colleague shrugged nervously, glancing toward the kitchen. "I don't know, but I'd keep my voice down if I were you." Meanwhile, in the back office, the restaurant's manager was reviewing paperwork when his phone buzzed. A text lit up the screen, and as he read it, his face paled. His chair screeched against the floor as he shot to his feet, his heart racing. The message was short but clear. "She's here." The manager didn't waste a second. He straightened his tie, grabbed his notepad, and hurried out of his office. His usually calm demeanor was replaced with a sense of urgency, which caught the attention of a few employees passing by. They exchanged curious glances, but didn't dare ask questions. The manager was known for his composed, professional manner, and seeing him so visibly on edge was unsettling. He scanned the dining area quickly but didn't see her. His chest tightened as he realized she must have left. Turning to one of the hosts near the entrance, he asked in a low voice, "Did a woman just leave?" Mid-30s, dark hair, elegant but understated. The host nodded slowly. "Yeah, she was just here." The waiter, She hesitated, unsure whether to continue. "What did the waiter do?" The manager pressed, his tone sharper than usual. "Well, I think he turned her away," the host admitted nervously. "Said something about us being too busy for walk-ins." The manager's face darkened, and he exhaled sharply. "Which waiter?" he asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. The host hesitated again, glancing toward the dining area, where the waiter in question was busy clearing plates from a table. The manager followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. Without another word, he walked briskly toward the waiter, who was oblivious to the storm brewing around him. "Excuse me," the manager said, his voice low but firm. The waiter looked up, surprised. "Can I have a word with you in private?" The waiter blinked, clearly puzzled by the sudden request, but nodded. He followed the manager toward the back, where they could speak without being overheard. The manager turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Do you remember a woman who came in a few minutes ago? Dark hair, classy, didn't make a scene when you turned her away?" The manager asked, his tone measured but tinged with tension. The waiter frowned, trying to recall. "Oh, her. Yeah, I remember. She didn't have a reservation, and we're packed tonight, so I told her we couldn't seat her." "Why? Was she someone important?" The manager stared at him for a moment, his jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea who that was?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. The waiter shrugged, clearly still not understanding the gravity of the situation. "No clue. Just another customer who thought she could walk in without a booking." The manager took a deep breath, as if trying to keep his composure. "That customer is not just anyone. She's the owner's wife." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the waiter just stared at the manager, processing what he had heard. Then his face went pale. "Wait, what? She's... Are you serious?" "Dead serious," the manager replied. "And if she tells him about this, you won't just be in trouble. You might be out of a job." The waiter's mind raced. He tried to remember everything he had said to her, every detail of their interaction. His stomach sank as he realized how dismissive and rude he had been. I didn't know," he stammered. "She didn't say anything. She didn't look like..." The manager cut him off. "She didn't need to say anything. And it's not about how she looked. It's about how you treat people, period. This restaurant has a reputation for excellence, not just in food, but in service. What you did today goes against everything we stand for." The waiter opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He knew the manager was right. Instead, he swallowed hard and asked, "What do I do now?" The manager rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated but trying to think. "For starters, you're going to apologize. If she comes back, and I'll make sure she does, you'll personally make it right. Until then, you'd better hope she doesn't call her husband." The waiter nodded, though his mind was still racing. He couldn't help but wonder why she hadn't revealed who she was right then and there. If she was the boss's wife, she could have easily called him out on the spot. Why hadn't she? Was she testing him? Or did she have a different plan in mind? As the manager walked away, the waiter felt a pit in his stomach. He replayed the encounter in his head, kicking himself for not handling it better. But it was too late to change what had happened. All he could do now was wait and hope for a chance to fix his mistake. Meanwhile, the woman had left the restaurant and was sitting in her car in the parking lot. She wasn't angry, though she had every right to be. Instead, she felt a mix of disappointment and curiosity. She had seen the waiter's behavior for what it was, an assumption based on appearances, a judgment made too quickly. It wasn't the first time she had experienced something like this, and sadly, it probably wouldn't be the last. But what intrigued her was how the restaurant would handle it. She knew her husband ran a tight ship, and she trusted him to address the situation. Still, part of her wondered how far the waiter would go to make things right, or if he even would. She decided to give it time, knowing the truth would reveal itself soon enough. Back inside the restaurant, the atmosphere remained tense. The staff whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what had happened. Word had spread quickly that the woman was someone important, though not everyone knew the full story. The waiter, meanwhile, went about his tasks with a heavy heart, his usual confidence replaced with anxiety. As the evening went on, the manager kept glancing at his phone, half expecting a call from the owner. But the call never came. Instead, he received a text message from the woman herself. It was brief but clear. "We'll talk tomorrow." The manager exhaled, relieved that she hadn't escalated the situation immediately. But he also knew that tomorrow could bring consequences for the entire team, not just the waiter. He made a mental note to prepare for whatever was to come. The night ended quietly, with the restaurant returning to its usual rhythm. But beneath the surface, the tension lingered. The waiter couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake that might cost him everything, and the manager couldn't help but wonder what the woman had in mind when she said they would talk tomorrow. What would she say? What would she do? And most importantly, what lesson was there to be learned from all of this? The answers were still unclear, but one thing was certain: the story wasn't over yet. The next morning, the restaurant opened as usual, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. The staff moved a little faster, their smiles a little tighter. Everyone seemed to know something was coming, though no one could say exactly what. The waiter from the previous night arrived for his shift looking more subdued than usual. Gone was the confident swagger he usually carried, replaced by a sense of nervous energy. He tried to act normal, but it was clear his mind was elsewhere. The manager, meanwhile, was preparing for the day with a focus he rarely displayed. He had barely slept the night before, replaying the events in his head and anticipating the conversation with the owner's wife. He had sent the staff a brief reminder about maintaining high standards of service, careful not to single anyone out, but making it clear that mistakes like the one from last night would not be tolerated. It wasn't just about saving face. It was about upholding the reputation of the restaurant, which had taken years to build. By mid-morning, the manager received another text from the woman. This time, it was even shorter. "I'll be there at noon." The hours leading up to noon dragged on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. The waiter could barely focus, fumbling with simple tasks and avoiding eye contact with his coworkers. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would she come in alone? Would the owner be with her? Would she even remember him? He doubted the last part. People like her probably dealt with so many interactions every day that a small incident like this wouldn't stick. At least that's what he told himself to calm his nerves. As the clock struck noon, the staff collectively braced themselves. The front doors opened, and she stepped inside. This time, she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a man in a tailored suit, his presence commanding yet calm. It didn't take long for the staff to recognize him, the owner himself. The room seemed to hold its breath as the pair approached the host's stand. The manager was the first to greet them, his demeanor professional but visibly tense. "Good afternoon," he said, forcing a smile. "It's an honor to have you both here." The woman smiled back, her expression warm but measured. "Good afternoon," she replied. "I thought it would be good to come by and see how things are running." Her words were polite, but there was an unmistakable weight to them. The manager nodded, gesturing toward a private table that had been prepared for them. "Of course. Right this way." As they walked through the dining area, the staff couldn't help but watch, their eyes darting between the couple and the waiter, who stood frozen near the bar. He felt like a deer caught in headlights, unsure whether to approach or stay out of sight. His instincts told him to disappear, but he knew that wasn't an option. He had to face this, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The man scanned the room quickly before his eyes landed on the couple's table. A smile spread across his face, not a warm one, but the kind that carried a sharp edge. Without waiting to be invited, he walked directly to their table. The staff froze, unsure of what to do, as they watched the scene unfold. "Ah, there you are," the man said, his voice smooth but dripping with something almost predatory. "I was wondering where I'd find you." The owner's expression hardened as he looked up. "This isn't the time or place," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Oh, but I think it's the perfect time," the man countered, pulling out a chair and sitting down uninvited. His eyes flicked to the woman, his smile widening. "And I see you've brought her along. Lovely." The woman's posture stiffened, though her expression remained calm. She didn't say anything, but her silence spoke volumes. There was a history here, something unspoken but heavy. The owner's jaw tightened as he leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You need to leave." The man leaned back in his chair, looking completely unfazed. "Why so hostile? I'm just here for a friendly chat. After all, it's been so long since we've seen each other." By now, the staff was on high alert. The manager stood near the bar, trying to decide whether to intervene or let the situation play out. The waiter, too, watched from a distance, his unease growing by the second. He didn't know who this man was, but it was clear his arrival had thrown everything into chaos. The man's gaze shifted to the woman again. "So, how's life treating you?" "Still playing the supportive wife, I see. Always the perfect picture of grace." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but she still didn't respond. The owner, however, had had enough. "I won't ask again," he said, his voice low but dangerous. "Leave. Now." The man chuckled, clearly enjoying the reaction he was provoking. All right," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I can see I'm not welcome. But before I go—" He leaned in, his tone dropping to something almost conspiratorial. "You might want to check your books. I think you'll find a few surprises." With that, he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. The staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what had just happened. The owner and his wife remained seated, their expressions unreadable. It wasn't until the man was completely out of sight that the woman finally spoke. "That was unexpected," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. The owner didn't respond immediately. Instead, he rubbed his temples, as if trying to process what had just happened. Finally, he said, "He's bluffing. He has to be." "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. He hesitated, which was answer enough. The woman sighed and leaned back in her chair. "You know he doesn't make idle threats." The owner nodded, his jaw tightening again. "I'll handle it," he said firmly, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. The rest of their meal was quiet, their earlier sense of calm completely shattered. The waiter, who had been watching from a distance, couldn't help but feel like things had just taken a darker turn. He didn't know the details, but he could tell this wasn't just a personal dispute. Whatever that man had meant about checking the books, it was clear it wasn't good. After the couple left, the atmosphere in the restaurant remained tense. The staff whispered among themselves, speculating about who the man was and what he had meant. The manager, however, quickly put an end to the gossip. "Focus on your work," he said sternly. "This isn't our business." But for the waiter, it felt personal. He couldn't explain why, but he had a nagging feeling that the situation was far from over, and that it might escalate in ways none of them were prepared for. Later that evening, after the restaurant had closed, the owner returned to his office. He sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen as if it held all the answers. His wife stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No, you've done enough. I'll figure this out." She hesitated, then leaned down and kissed his cheek. "Call me if you need anything." Once she was gone, the owner turned back to the computer and began going through the restaurant's financial records. At first, everything seemed normal. The numbers added up, and nothing looked out of place. But as he dug deeper, he started to notice small discrepancies, tiny amounts missing here and there, just enough to fly under the radar, but significant enough to add up over time. His heart sank as the realization hit him. The man hadn't been bluffing. Someone had been siphoning money from the business, and it had been going on for months. But who? And how had they managed to hide it for so long? As the hours ticked by, the owner's frustration grew. He pored over the records, trying to piece together the puzzle, but the more he uncovered, the more questions he had. By the time the clock struck midnight, he was no closer to finding the answers. All he knew was that whoever was behind this had been careful, very careful. The next morning, he called an emergency meeting with the management team. The tension in the room was palpable as he explained what he had found. "This is serious," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We need to figure out who's responsible and put an end to it. I won't let this place be ruined by someone's greed." The manager nodded, his expression grim. "I'll start looking into it right away. But if it's been going on this long, whoever's behind it knows what they're doing. It might take time to track them down." "We don't have time," the owner said sharply. "Every day this continues, we're losing more." As the meeting broke up, the staff exchanged uneasy glances. The waiter, who had been standing near the back of the room, felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't help but wonder if the mysterious man from the previous day was somehow involved. And if he was, what did that mean for the future of the restaurant? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was darker than anyone had expected. The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking. The restaurant buzzed with activity the next day, but an undercurrent of tension gripped everyone. The owner had been in his office since early morning, combing through records and making phone calls. The staff, although curious, stayed focused, sensing the weight of the situation. The waiter, still reeling from his near miss with disaster, worked quietly but kept his ears open. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mysterious man's warning was only the tip of the iceberg. By early afternoon, the owner emerged from his office, his expression a mix of frustration and determination. He motioned for the manager to join him in the back, and they disappeared into a meeting that stretched on for over an hour. When they finally reappeared, the manager's face was pale. He called a quick staff meeting, pulling everyone into the dining room after the lunch rush. "We've uncovered some issues with the restaurant's finances," the manager began, his tone serious. "The owner has reason to believe someone's been skimming money. This isn't a small matter, and it affects everyone here. We're implementing new procedures immediately, and there will be a thorough review of all activities. If anyone knows anything or notices something unusual, now is the time to speak up." The room fell silent. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said a word. The waiter stood near the back, a knot tightening in his stomach. He didn't know much about the inner workings of the restaurant, but the implications were clear. Someone on the inside had been betraying them all. As the meeting broke up, the manager pulled the waiter aside. "I need you to keep an eye out," he said quietly. "If you see or hear anything suspicious, let me know immediately." The waiter nodded, his nerves fraying further. He wanted to prove himself after the incident with the owner's wife, but this felt like stepping into a minefield. He decided to focus on his duties, hoping to avoid further complications. But fate had other plans. Later that evening, as the dinner rush began to wind down, the waiter noticed something unusual. One of his coworkers, a server who had been with the restaurant for years, seemed unusually tense. She was glancing over her shoulder repeatedly, and when she thought no one was watching, she slipped into the office where the financial records were kept. The waiter hesitated, debating whether to follow, but curiosity got the better of him. He crept down the hallway, staying just out of sight, and peeked through the partially open office door. The server was rummaging through a drawer, her hands moving quickly as if she were searching for something specific. The waiter's heart raced. Was this the break they were looking for, or was he misinterpreting the situation? Before he could decide what to do, the woman suddenly froze. She looked up, spotting him through the crack in the door. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, they stared at each other in silence. Then, without warning, she bolted. The waiter barely had time to react before she pushed past him, heading straight for the exit. "Stop her," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the restaurant. The staff and a few lingering customers turned to see the commotion. The manager rushed out from behind the bar, blocking the server's path just as she reached the front door. "What's going on?" he demanded, his tone sharp. "She was in the office," the waiter explained, catching up and struggling to catch his breath. "I saw her going through the records." The manager's expression darkened as he turned to the server. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice cold. The woman's face was pale, but she tried to compose herself. I thought I left something in there earlier. It's nothing." But her excuse didn't hold up. The owner, who had been watching from a corner table, stood and approached the group. "Let's find out," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. The server's shoulders slumped, and she looked like she was about to protest, but the owner was already leading the way back to the office. The manager, waiter, and a few other staff members followed, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Once inside, the owner began going through the drawer the server had been searching. It didn't take long for him to find what she had been looking for: a hidden ledger, tucked beneath a stack of old files. He opened it, his face growing darker with each page he flipped. "This is it," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "This is the proof we needed." The server's face crumpled. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." The owner stared at her, his expression unreadable. "You've been stealing from us," he said, "and you didn't think it would catch up to you." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't just me," she blurted out. "I was pressured. He made me do it." The room went silent. "Who?" the owner asked, his voice sharp. The server hesitated, then said the name of the mysterious man who had visited the restaurant. The waiter felt his blood run cold. He had suspected the man was involved, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through him. The owner's jaw tightened. "I should have known," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He always had a way of getting others to do his dirty work. The server sobbed quietly, but the owner showed no sympathy. "You've put everything we've built at risk," he said. "You're done here." The manager stepped forward, guiding the server out of the office. The rest of the staff watched in stunned silence as she was escorted out of the restaurant. Once she was gone, the owner turned to the group. "This isn't over," he said, "but we're going to fix it." The waiter felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, guilt, and a lingering sense of unease. The immediate threat had been dealt with, but the shadow of the mysterious man still loomed. It was clear he wasn't going to back down easily. The restaurant was quieter than usual the next day, the events of the previous evening still lingering in the air. The staff went about their tasks cautiously, unsure how to navigate the aftermath of such a dramatic turn. The owner, however, seemed steadier than he had been in weeks. With the truth partially uncovered, he was determined to take control and ensure the restaurant's future was secure. The woman who had been caught, the trusted server who had worked there for years, was no longer a presence in the space. Her absence left a void, but it also lifted some of the tension. Still, her revelations about being pressured by the mysterious man opened more questions than answers. What exactly was his endgame? And how had he managed to manipulate someone so thoroughly? The owner spent much of the day in his office, making calls and working through what needed to be done. His wife joined him briefly in the afternoon, sitting across from him with a cup of tea in hand. They spoke in low tones, strategizing their next steps. She had been quiet during much of the chaos, but now her resolve was clear. "He won't stop unless we confront him," she said, her voice steady. "You know that." The owner nodded. "I've already reached out to some people," he replied. "We're going to tighten." The staff and a few lingering customers turned to see the commotion. The manager rushed out from behind the bar, blocking the server's path just as she reached the front door. "What's going on?" he demanded, his tone sharp. "She was in the office," the waiter explained, catching up and struggling to catch his breath. "I saw her going through the records." The manager's expression darkened as he turned to the server. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice cold. The woman's face was pale, but she tried to compose herself. I thought I left something in there earlier. It's nothing." But her excuse didn't hold up. The owner, who had been watching from a corner table, stood and approached the group. "Let's find out," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. The server's shoulders slumped, and she looked like she was about to protest, but the owner was already leading the way back to the office. The manager, waiter, and a few other staff members followed, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Once inside, the owner began going through the drawer the server had been searching. It didn't take long for him to find what she had been looking for: a hidden ledger, tucked beneath a stack of old files. He opened it, his face growing darker with each page he flipped. "This is it," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "This is the proof we needed." The server's face crumpled. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." The owner stared at her, his expression unreadable. "You've been stealing from us," he said, "and you didn't think it would catch up to you." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't just me," she blurted out. "I was pressured. He made me do it." The room went silent. "Who?" the owner asked, his voice sharp. The server hesitated, then said the name of the mysterious man who had visited the restaurant. The waiter felt his blood run cold. He had suspected the man was involved, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through him. The owner's jaw tightened. "I should have known," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He always had a way of getting others to do his dirty work. The server sobbed quietly, but the owner showed no sympathy. "You've put everything we've built at risk," he said. "You're done here." The manager stepped forward, guiding the server out of the office. The rest of the staff watched in stunned silence as she was escorted out of the restaurant. Once she was gone, the owner turned to the group. "This isn't over," he said, "but we're going to fix it." The waiter felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, guilt, and a lingering sense of unease. The immediate threat had been dealt with, but the shadow of the mysterious man still loomed. It was clear he wasn't going to back down easily. The restaurant was quieter than usual the next day, the events of the previous evening still lingering in the air. The staff went about their tasks cautiously, unsure how to navigate the aftermath of such a dramatic turn. The owner, however, seemed steadier than he had been in weeks. With the truth partially uncovered, he was determined to take control and ensure the restaurant's future was secure. The woman who had been caught, the trusted server who had worked there for years, was no longer a presence in the space. Her absence left a void, but it also lifted some of the tension. Still, her revelations about being pressured by the mysterious man opened more questions than answers. What exactly was his endgame? And how had he managed to manipulate someone so thoroughly? The owner spent much of the day in his office, making calls and working through what needed to be done. His wife joined him briefly in the afternoon, sitting across from him with a cup of tea in hand. They spoke in low tones, strategizing their next steps. She had been quiet during much of the chaos, but now her resolve was clear. "He won't stop unless we confront him," she said, her voice steady. "You know that." The owner nodded. "I've already reached out to some people," he replied. "We're going to tighten everything. Accounting, security, everything. If he's hoping for another weak spot to exploit, he won't find one." She gave him a small, encouraging smile. "Good, but it's not just about fixing the systems. You need to remind him who he's dealing with." Later that evening, just as the restaurant was closing, the mysterious man appeared again, as if summoned by their conversation. He strolled in with the same air of confidence, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the owner and his wife standing by the bar. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "Still holding it together. I see. Impressive." The owner stepped forward, his posture firm. "We know what you've been doing," he said bluntly. "And it ends now." The man raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't play games. The owner shot back. We found the ledger. We know you've been using people here to steal from us. You thought you could push us into a corner, but you underestimated us. The man's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He shrugged casually. So you figured out a little piece of the puzzle. Congratulations, but you don't really think this is over, do you? People like me don't walk away that easily. The owner's wife stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. No, you don't walk away easily, but neither do we. You might have scared some people into working for you, but your time here is finished. We've already taken steps to ensure it. Her words seemed to catch him off guard. He glanced between the two of them, his confidence wavering. And what steps would those be? He asked, his tone less sure now. The owner folded his arms. We've contacted the authorities. All the evidence is in their hands now. If you so much as step foot near this place again, you'll be facing charges. I suggest you think carefully about your next move. For the first time, the man looked genuinely unsettled. He stood there in silence, his mind clearly racing. Finally, he let out a dry laugh and shook his head. You've got guts. I'll give you that. Fine. You've won this round. But don't think this is the last you've heard of me. He turned and walked out, leaving the restaurant in tense silence. The owner and his wife exchanged a glance, both of them exhaling deeply. The confrontation had been nerve-wracking, but they had stood their ground. It wasn't just about protecting their business. It was about proving they wouldn't be bullied or intimidated. Over the next few days, the restaurant slowly returned to normal. The staff felt a renewed sense of unity, knowing their employer had taken a stand. The changes the owner implemented brought reassurance that the place they cared about was secure. Security measures were strengthened, financial systems were made more transparent, and communication between the team improved. The incident, while stressful, had ultimately brought them closer together. The waiter, who had been quietly observing everything, couldn't help but reflect on the journey he had been through. From his initial mistake to witnessing the uncovering of the scheme, he had learned more about responsibility and resilience than he ever expected. He realized the importance of treating every person with respect and of standing firm when faced with challenges. One evening, as the dinner rush was winding down, the owner approached him. I've noticed you've been working hard lately, he said, his tone lighter than it had been in days. I appreciate that. The waiter nodded, a bit surprised. Thank you. I wanted to make up for everything. The owner smiled. You've done more than that. Just keep learning. That's all anyone can ask. As the days turned into weeks, the restaurant flourished. Word spread about the owner's integrity and the way he had handled the crisis, bringing in new customers who admired the values he stood for. Regulars continued to return, drawn by not just the food but the sense of community the place offered. The mysterious man never returned, whether it was the threat of legal action or the realization that he had underestimated his opponents. He seemed to have disappeared for good. The server who had been caught in his scheme wrote a letter to the owner, apologizing for her actions. While her betrayal still stung, the owner decided to focus on the lessons learned rather than the mistakes made. For the owner and his wife, the ordeal was a reminder of their own strength and the importance of protecting what they had built together. They made a point to spend more time at the restaurant, not just managing it but connecting with the staff and customers. It wasn't just a business to them. It was a reflection of their values and their commitment to each other. In the end, the experience left everyone with a deeper understanding of resilience and trust. The waiter, the staff, the customers, all of them saw the restaurant not just as a place to eat, but as a space where people stood up for what was right. And for the owner and his wife, it was a reminder that together, they could face anything.